Welcome to It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 95. Hello, everyone. This is It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. It is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from 1866 to 1930. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and in this week, we're going to range much further out than 1930, as we are going to range into the 1980s and 1990s. Because on Thursday, July 24th, 2025, one of the two biggest stars of the 1980s and the person who made the WWE's national expansion possible, Hulk Hogan, also known as Hollywood Hulk Hogan in his WCW days, passed away at 71 years of age. And if you've listened to this podcast frequently, you know that I have never been a big fan of Hulk Hogan. I've said lots of derogatory things about him in the past, and I'm not going to go back on calling him out on his shameless self-promotion and on a lot of the untruths he's told over the years. But you also want to give a fair and balanced account of the man's career, particularly when he's not with us anymore. And I've also said in other podcasts that the national expansion that Vince McMahon wanted to do would not have been possible without Hulk Hogan. Vince McMahon did not want to promote the best wrestling in the world. If you want to know why I just started disliking Hogan, it was because I thought he was a very poor wrestler in the top spot in the company that was trying to go national. But what Vince McMahon wanted to promote was comic book wrestling. WWE or WWF, and even before that, WWWF, was never interested in promoting the best wrestling matches. They promoted spectacle, the big event, Hogan versus Andre in 1987. They wanted to get people to come out to the show not to see a great wrestling match, to see a spectacle, more sizzle than steak. And Hogan was ideal for that spot. He was a bigger than life character. The one thing you can never fault him for is he had a lot of charisma. He was the kind of larger than life superhero type wrestler that was ideal for what Vince was trying to promote. In that respect, he was ideal for this national expansion that Vince McMahon wanted to pull off. I never saw Hogan until Hogan was in the WWF in late 83, early 84. But I knew who he was before internet and before all of the mass media today. We had magazines in the 1980s. That's how you kept up on the news, what was going on in professional wrestling. Because most of the magazines were based out of New York, the New York promotion always got photo coverage in the magazines. So I saw Hogan for the first time as Hulk Hogan in WWF around 1981. I think I saw some magazines probably at the library in 1980. But if I remember rightly, Bruno and Bob Backlund were more the focus of those magazines. But when Hogan came as a heel to WWF and wrestled Andre the first time in 81, I did see him in the magazines. And then he was in, did I see him? I'm just going on memory here. I think I saw him in the magazines in AWA before I saw the Rocky 3 movie that came out in 82. Because Hogan left WWF because he took the movie role and Vince McMahon Sr. didn't want him to take the movie role. So when he left, he thought that his time in the Northeastern promotion, which would become a national promotion after Vince bought it in 1982, he thought his time was done because Vince McMahon Sr. was not happy that he took this movie role to have this part in Rocky 3, which made Hogan a huge star in the United States. I never saw him as Terry Boulder. I never saw him as Sterling Golden. I've seen pictures now since, and I think I've even maybe seen a match or two since, but at the time, never seen him before he showed up on WWF television in 1983. Because in 1980, I think it was 83, Wrestling at the Chase, which was a locally produced show of the St. Louis promotion, became a television product for Vince McMahon. He had got that TV time slot away from the St. Louis promotion with the help of Larry Matisick, who was running a rival promotion at that point in time. When Sam Muchnick retired in January 1st, 1982, he had sold the promotion to Pat O'Connor, Bob Geigel, and Vern Gagne, who had all had a piece of St. Louis before then. Larry Matisick was really the transition, the key piece in Sam retiring and that office continuing to promote the type of wrestling that Sam had always promoted and made St. Louis such a successful town. Well, instead of keeping Larry, they disaffected Larry because they wanted to produce the same crappy wrestling they were running in Kansas City. And when Larry tried to tell them that was not going to play in St. Louis, they didn't listen. And I said that I had found the first card my sister and I ever attended. I think I've also found the last card my sister and I attended together, and I thought it was in 85 or 86. But now I'm starting to think it might have been 84. So much sooner than I thought. I'm going to go over that card here in a future episode, and I'm also going to write about it on the website. But to get back to WWF and how they got that time slot, so Larry Matisick leaves, starts a rival promotion, but Larry is the local guy who's thought very much of. Pat O'Connor is thought well of, but when people think of Sam's promotion, they think of Larry Matisick. And Larry Matisick has connections with KPLR through Sam, so he helps Vince McMahon get that TV slot. So one day, instead of seeing the Wrestling at the Chase show from the KPLR studio, I turn on wrestling at 11 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, and I've got this WWF cartoon wrestling crap on, which I was never a fan of. I probably never would have been a fan of it until I started watching primetime wrestling with Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan. But Hogan shows up in late 83. Bob Backlund had been the longtime champion. This was just a couple months after Vince took the show over, so he had to have taken the show over late summer, early fall of 83. In December of 83, the Iron Sheik shocks the world and beats Bob Backlund for the title. But if you know WWF, that was just to set up the transition. They didn't normally have the baby faces ever go against each other. So this was to set up. Sheik took the title from Backlund. And then the next month at the Madison Square Garden card, Sheiky was going to drop the title to Hogan, which is what he did. And from that point on, Hogan was the main WWF champion for, let's see, we're talking January 84 to probably probably April of 91 when he dropped it to Warrior. And then he got it back in 92, but because he took it from Slaughter, and then he traded it with a couple more people. But Vince was already, you could tell, was looking for replacements for Hogan around 91. But from 84 to 91, so for 7 years, Hogan was the guy. Yes, he lost the title for about a year in a screwy finish with Andre, then Randy Savage won the tournament, but that was only to set up Hogan going off to make a film. Hogan wouldn't have dropped the title if he hadn't been making a film. And the one challenge Hogan presented for anybody that's booking wrestling is they build him at 6'8" and 320. My guess is he was probably more around 6'5", and he was in the high twos or the very low threes. Hogan being so big, you have to have heels that appear to be a physical threat to him. And one of the things you have to admire about Roddy Piper set him up as a heel that could give Hogan a run for his money, being 100 pounds lighter than Hogan. But Hogan went through just a legion of monsters: King Kong Bundy, Big John Studd, Kamala, One Man Gang, Big Boss Man. Every big guy that they could think of, they brought in. Now, those were not his best opponents. His best opponents were actually Paul Orndorff, who I think took Hogan through the best matches that he ever had, and Randy Macho Man Savage. Those were the two best opponents for Hogan. But Hogan went through a number of monsters during his title run. And that could have been the thing that contributed to all his back issues later in life. Hogan didn't take a ton of bumps. He took a few, but he didn't take a ton of bumps. But he was constantly picking these huge guys up and slamming them. And yeah, they were going up for him, but that's still a lot of weight. You're picking up. Some schlub is not going to be able to go out and pick up One Man Gang, even if One Man Gang is helping him. So it takes some power and everything, and it puts pressure on the back and the joints and everything else. So it's not easy, even though they're going up for you. During that run, though, Hogan was the undisputed guy. I can't remember him doing a clean job, probably until he went to the WWE in 2003. That's probably when he started doing a few clean jobs, and he was in his early 50s at that point. But Hogan might lose, but Hogan rarely lost where he didn't have an out, and that's whether he was a heel or a babyface. But the one thing you cannot take away from him is he was the biggest mainstream crossover wrestling star of the 1980s and the early 1990s. Hogan made movies. Hogan was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And Hogan was on talk shows and things that were normally wrestlers would never be able to get on, because one thing Vince did do, Vince did not take professional wrestling out of smoky arenas. The no smoking laws took professional wrestling out of those arenas. But what he did do was he made wrestling more acceptable. When you were a wrestling fan in the 80s, you wanted to hide your head and let nobody find out that you liked wrestling. Now people can say they like wrestling, and it doesn't have that same tint or stain of you're some kind of kook or you're an idiot that's being fooled by these fakers or any of that. He was able to get mainstream acceptance for professional wrestling. He started calling it sports entertainment, which nobody else did, but that was all part of Vince's vision to change the image of professional wrestling from something dirty and sordid and fooling people into something more mainstream, just another form of entertainment for people to be able to enjoy. In that respect, he was very successful. And Hogan was the main person in the 80s that helped him do that. And we'll talk about in the recommendation there, WWE Vault has put out several things that I'm going to recommend as far as Hogan's career. Hogan was never going to put on the best match on a card. But Hogan was going to do the things that made sense for Hulk Hogan to do, which is the one thing I don't think a lot of wrestlers get today. Hogan didn't do things that the Hulk Hogan character would not do. It's one of the things that helped him get over as such a dominant superstar. He wasn't doing trading wins and losses with people. On the rare occasions he lost, it was usually in a tag match, and there was usually an out as well. Now, I can't ignore all the things I've said about him over the years, and I stand by the things that I said. I never liked him. I always booed him and was always rooting for all of his opponents. So when WrestleMania 1, I was rooting for Orndorff and Piper, and WrestleMania 3, I was rooting for Andre. I can't say I was rooting for the Warrior because The Warrior had a great physique, but you couldn't understand a word he said. I like guys like Orndorff, Piper. I tended to like the heels in WWF because they were always going up against Hogan, and Hogan was not my cup of tea. It's just he didn't need to embellish on all of the accomplishments he had through the years. I found later on, as I knew more, his protecting of his legacy sometimes was a little bit much. But rest in peace, Hulkster. You were the biggest star of the 18 or the 1980s. I can't take that away from you. There's going to be people that definitely miss you. And I tell you right now, my cousin Mike was one of the biggest Hulkamaniacs around. I was wishing Danny was around today so we could talk about this because Dan was not a big Hogan fan. Dan was a fan of Randy Macho Man Savage, but his brother was one of the biggest Hulk fans going and could not understand why we did not like him. Because most of the people in the 80s that watched professional wrestling were Hogan fans. I think the thing that surprised me the most was that Hogan passed away at such a relatively young age. While he's had some health issues in the last few years, he did use steroids. He was admitted that. Hogan did not have a lot of the bad habits that his generation of wrestlers had. You didn't hear about him using recreational drugs. You didn't hear about him drinking that much. He had always worked out and enjoyed pretty good health. He looked slower and not as in good shape the last few times he was on national TV, but I mean, I've seen wrestlers 20 years younger than him that looked a lot worse than he did. So I was just shocked that he died so young. So rest in peace, Hulk. He left a wife and two children, and our thoughts and condolences are with them, as well as his longtime manager and friend, Jimmy Hart. Wishing you guys all the best. I started thinking today about who Hogan to me would be most comparable to in history. And I think it would be George Hackenschmidt. And I think a lot of people would be surprised about that because I've never held Hogan in great regard, but I always held George Hackenschmidt in great regard as one of my heroes and one of the people that in history that I would find most worthy of being emulated. President Theodore Roosevelt in 1904 and 1905 said that if he could be anybody else, he would be George Hackenschmidt. But there are some similarities, besides the fact that they both were really big, strong, muscular guys. Hackenschmidt was not a wrestler for that long before he won the world championship, be it in legitimate contests. But Hogan started wrestling around 78, 79, became Hulk Hogan in 1980, and then by 1984, January 1984, he's the world champion for a company that's getting ready to go through national expansion. George Hackenschmidt was a civil engineer. He was a athlete who had already had some world records in weightlifting at 19 and 20 years old. And he trained at the St. Petersburg, I think it was the St. Petersburg Athletic and Cycling Club. Hackenschmidt wrestled at the club as just kind of a hobby, but he never seriously pursued it until in 1898 when he was 21. George Lurick, who was already a professional wrestler at the time, came to the St. Petersburg club and wrestled the amateurs, and he beat everybody, including Hackenschmidt, but it took him over half an hour to beat Hackenschmidt. And Hackenschmidt was irritated that he had lost to Lurick because even though Lurick was experienced, Hackenschmidt was much stronger and felt that if he had spent more time in the wrestling room and practiced more, that his strength and technique would have defeated Lurick. And George Lurick avoided Hackenschmidt. He used to brag about beating Hackenschmidt, but he avoided him in every tournament they were in together when Hackenschmidt became a professional. One of the things I came across a couple years ago and I started to change it, and now I'm going to change it back wherever I find it. I believe both George Lurick and George Hackenschmidt's first names were spelled Georg with no E on the end of it. And I had started to spell that in some of the books, but I didn't go back and change the text within the book. So I changed the outside cover back to J, back to George. And I'm going to just do that with the post because it was anglicized in the United States to George, and I don't want to have it differently in two different spaces. It's no different than Sorikichi Matsuda, who really wrestled in the United States, or they wrote his name in the newspapers in the United States as Sorikichi Matsada. His real name was Kojiro Matsuda, and his sumo name had been Torikichi. Well, they kind of mangled it in the newspapers, and he was always Sorikichi Matsada. But because he's called Sorikichi Matsuda in most references available on professional wrestling, I call him Sorikichi Matsuda in my book, but explain that his name was actually Sorikichi Matsada in the United States. And so if you look in the old archives and you put in Sorikichi Matsuda, you're not going to come back with anything. Apparently, George for both of them is Georg, but I'm just going to leave it the way that they spelled it in the United States as George. Sorry for that tangent. After Lurick beat Hackenschmidt in the gym in those training matches, Hackenschmidt got much more serious about his training. And so for the next 2 years, he trained. He entered some local tournaments in Russia. And then in 1900, he started wrestling in the Greco-Roman tournaments in Europe. And if you won the tournaments, you were considered the world champion. In 1900, he won the first one or two tournaments he was in, but he had to withdraw from the third one because he had injured his arm. And when he had injured his arm, he made the acquaintance of the doctor to the Tsar, Dr. Van Krzyzewski. And this physician was also a physical cultural specialist. And so he helped train Lurick, not Lurick, I'm switching my Georges. He helped train Hackenschmidt for the 1901 championships, which Hackenschmidt won and could claim the world title. And he would be the world champion for the next 7 years. Tragically, Dr. Van Krzyzewski died. He had a massive heart attack and died at 61, a few months before Hackenschmidt was able to win the last tournament or two. So he never actually saw George Hackenschmidt become the recognized world champion. Hackenschmidt, after winning the recognized world championship, did something a lot of people had not done in the past, and that is he started traveling the world defending the championship. He would go to America, Australia, New Zealand, all throughout Europe, defending his claim to the World Heavyweight Championship. And in Europe, the dominant style was Greco-Roman wrestling, so that is what he initially started out in. And he would have defend his title in Greco-Roman wrestling for the first 3 or 4 years. When he went to Australia, he was introduced to catch wrestling, and he saw that that was the more dominant form in the United States and Australia and places outside of Europe. So then he started to defend the title in catch wrestling and started to learn catch wrestling. He was never a hooker. He never got really good at submissions, but he did get good at picking people up with single legs and double legs and that. So he did get good with holds below the waist, but he never was good with submissions. And with as strong as he was, a double leg or a well executed single leg would probably be very hard to stop with a guy like Hackenschmidt. Hackenschmidt comes to the United States in 1905, and unfortunately for Frank Gotch, Gotch actually wanted to wrestle Hackenschmidt in St. Louis in 1904 at the World's Fair. And that match probably would have drew a huge crowd because Gotch was the recognized American heavyweight wrestling champion. Unfortunately, he would end up wrestling Tom Jenkins, who is the only person that holds more than one win over Gotch. And Jenkins would take the American Heavyweight Championship back. And it was very poor timing because Jenkins went over to England at the end of 1904 and wrestled Hackenschmidt and lost. And then when Hackenschmidt came to the United States in 1905, Jenkins was still the champion. So Hackenschmidt wrestled Jenkins, but he didn't wrestle Gotch. Gotch would take the title back from Jenkins a few months later. The following year, Jenkins would become the defensive tactics slash physical training instructor for West Point, the United States Army's military academy, and he would go into semi-retirement. He had two more matches with Gotch after that, but I wouldn't really consider those competitive. So those matches were really those when they were Gotch holds 5 victories over Jenkins. Jenkins holds 3 victories over Gotch. But in the 6 competitive matches they had, they were 3-3. So that was very unwieldy way to say that, but they were 3-3 in competitive matches. But Gotch holds the laurels in that rivalry 5-3. Hackenschmidt goes back to Europe, has some big matches in England. He tries to get Lurick on the mat with him actually because they were wrestling on mats on stages at that point. Lurick wants no part of him. He leaves London rather than wrestle Hackenschmidt the following night after a challenge. Hackenschmidt holds the title, of course, until 1908 when he returns to the United States and wrestles Frank Gotch in a foul-filled mess. So Gotch wrestled Hackenschmidt in Chicago in 1908, and the referee was Ed Smith, who was an admirer of Frank Gotch and probably should not have been the referee because of how much he admired Frank Gotch. And he allowed Gotch to foul Hackenschmidt for 2 hours without ever warning him, threatening him with disqualification, anything. And Gotch dug his fingernails into Hackenschmidt's eyes, gouged his eyes. Palm struck him repeatedly, would hit him with elbows when they would be tied up. And this was supposed to be a best 2 out of 3 falls match. Hackenschmidt never retaliated. That was one of his downfalls in going against Gotch. So Gotch was considered a dirty wrestler, but he wrestled dirty as a way to defeat opponents. It was part of his strategy for winning. Tom Jenkins, when Gotch would foul him, Jenkins would just foul him right back. Jenkins got disqualified in one of their matches because he tried to punch Gotch. Hackenschmidt, a gentleman in the truest sense of the word, could not bring himself to violate the rules and put himself at a big competitive disadvantage. After 2 hours of Gotch doing this and Hackenschmidt realizing he wasn't going to be able to take Gotch down, he surrendered his title in the first fall. There was no 2 out of 3 fall match. He just surrendered the title to Gotch in the first fall and went back to Europe and was going to retire because he was already having some knee issues. He started feeling better and he went around doing exhibitions and he was training people. From the time that he had beat Gotch in 19 or Gotch had beat him in 1908, Gotch's management was trying to get him to come back for a rematch because they thought that was the biggest money-making match they could get and or they could put on, which proved to be correct. The rematch in 1911 on Labor Day drew over 30,000 fans to a ballpark at the Comiskey Field in Chicago. Professional wrestling would not draw a crowd that large again until the 1930s. The biggest match I know of in the teens was one of the Lewis versus Stecker matches in Omaha, and that drew 16,000 to a ballpark. So 30,000 fans, particularly in that time, was kind of unheard of. But they were trying to get him to come back from the time that Gotch beat him in 1908. And Hackenschmidt refused for the first 2 years because he thought his knees were in such bad shape he couldn't have a competitive match with Gotch. Around 1911, he had convinced himself that he had done enough exhibitions and that he thought his knee would hold up, so he accepted the match, which proved to be disastrous because his knees didn't hold up. He went into that match severely compromised. He did his best to hold Gotch off, but after 14 minutes, Gotch beat him with the first fall. And then in the second fall, Hackenschmidt was forced to roll to his back for the second fall rather than have his leg broken. And the fans thought that what they just witnessed, which was a shoot, was a work and that they were being built by the wrestlers. And they started throwing seat cushions and were at riotous conditions, 30,000 fans in Chicago. Hackenschmidt held that title, though, as you can see, from 1901 to 1908, which is a long time to hold a championship. And it mirrors the time that Hogan was the top star in the WWF as the world champion. Now, Hackenschmidt's wrestling contest, Hulk is working with his opponents, but pressure is not all that different. The pressure for Hackenschmidt is he cannot lose or his title's gone. The pressure for Hogan is if he really screws this match up, then it could hurt the company and the company's ability to draw because he is their biggest star. And there is no question about that. Wrestlers have all said that they wanted to be on the card that Hogan was on in the 80s because when Hogan was at the top of the card, that card was going to make more money, which meant more money for the wrestlers. I did want to make a few recommendations. I'm not going to give it much of an update because I'm still working on the website and I haven't had a chance to work on either book yet. I'm going to give an update about or not an update, I'm going to give a review of the card my sister and I went to, the last St. Louis card that I'm pretty sure that I have, which is earlier than I thought it was. But I wanted to do a recommendation because WWE Vault, of course, put out a bunch of Hulk Hogan stuff after his passing. And so if you go on YouTube and you go to WWE Vault, there will be a video about Hogan's unreleased classics, I think it is. It's about a 2 hour video. The first match on there is a match from WWF television in 1980 where he's Hulk Hogan for the first time and he's wearing long blue trunks and Freddie Blassie is his manager. And then the next thing they go to is Hogan versus uh, Andre in Madison Square Garden after the Shea Stadium match with Gorilla Monsoon as the special referee. So that's the right video if you've gotten to there. And I thought most of the matches there were pretty good examples of a Hogan match. It's not going to be the greatest wrestling you've ever seen. They're decent big man matches. And I really enjoyed the Hogan Andre one, and that's going to be one of the rare ones on the video where Hogan is not the winner. It was a good big man match, and Hogan has several good big man matches. His best match on that video is the one he has with Randy Savage when Savage is the Intercontinental Champion in 1986. Or it might have been right before Randy won the Intercontinental title. That's the best match. But there are several good big man matches on there. Besides Hogan and Andre, there's Hogan versus Kamala. And one of my favorites is Hogan versus One Man Gang. I thought One Man Gang was one of the best big men in wrestling. I thought Akeem the African Dream was a ridiculous thing and a rib by Vince. That's my recommendation for this week. Trey and Caleb and I are planning on in the future, we will do one episode a month of us together, and then the rest of the episodes are going to be just me. So most of the episodes will be solo, but you will get about once a month. I'll get together with the boys because I still want to inflict the Central States wrestling on them so they can see that, when people talk about the good old days that never ever existed. I don't care what period of history you're talking about or what subject. There was never a good old days in St. Louis at any time. There was never a good old days in professional wrestling or professional boxing. There was always strife and there was always things that were screwed up and there were always things that weren't right. And every history talk that I give, no matter the topic, whether it is St. Louis history, St. Louis building history, combat sports history, martial arts history, anything, there was never a good old days. There was never this golden age in history where everything was right and things were so much better. Things have always been screwed up, things were always done wrong, and there's never been a time in history where it was golden and everything was perfect. So anybody that is selling you the good old days, and a lot of politicians try to do that, they are trying to sell you a bunch of horse hockey, and you should treat it as such. I just want to end the episode by saying, rest in peace, Hulkster. You were never my favorite, but I have to give you credit for what you did for wrestling in the 1980s. Our heart really does go out to your family, and we hope that the next few weeks that they'll be comforted. Jimmy Hart, longtime manager, same thing for you. Until next week, everyone, take care. Bye bye.